At 7:45 on the morning of June 5, 1967, Israel threw almost its entire air force at Egypt in a single blow, and the bombs fell on empty runways. To understand how the most successful preemptive strike ever planned came apart in its opening minutes, we have to go back 3 weeks to a crisis that unfolded exactly as our own history records it. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. In mid-May 1967, Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt and the living symbol of pan-Arab nationalism, ordered the United Nations Emergency Force out of the Sinai Peninsula. Roughly 100,000 Egyptian troops moved in behind them. On May 22nd, Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, an act Israel had long declared a cause for war. On May 30th, King Hussein of Jordan flew to Cairo and signed a mutual defense pact that placed his army under Egyptian command. Israel, ringed by hostile forces, called up its reserves and watched its economy strangle under full mobilization. On June 1st, a shaken Levi Eshkol handed the defense ministry to Moshe Dayan, the one-eyed hero of 1956. Every one of these facts is real. What changed came at dawn on June 5th, a single message, delivered a few minutes differently. And what no one on either side yet understood was that this one message would eventually put a question on the table in Jerusalem that history had meant to defer for another 6 years. At Ajlun, in the hills of northern Jordan, radar operators watched their screens fill with aircraft. In our timeline, they saw exactly this, wave after wave of Israeli jets heading out over the Mediterranean, and transmitted a coded warning that died in a tangle of changed Egyptian codes and absent commanders. In this timeline, the warning gets through. It reaches Air Marshal Mohammed Sidqi Mahmoud, commander of the Egyptian Air Force, in usable form, and this time he is at his post rather than airborne with Field Marshal Amer en route to Bir Tamada. He has minutes. He uses them. Alert squadrons of MiG-21s scramble from Abu Suair, Inshas, and Cairo West. Aircraft that cannot get airborne are towed off the flight lines and scattered into the desert. When the Israeli formations sweep in low from the sea, the audacious western approach that should have caught everyone sleeping, they find cratered concrete, burning decoys, and empty revetments. Operation Focus, the plan that staked nearly the entire Israeli Air Force on 3 perfect hours, has punched into air. Israel's pilots were still the best in the region. That did not change, and it could not. Egyptian training was shallow, Egyptian ground control rigid, and in the dogfights over the Delta, the exchange rate favored Israel from the first day. But an air force that survives can fight, and Sidqi Mahmoud's preserved MiGs turned a 3-hour campaign into a war of attrition. Every Israeli sortie over Sinai now cost aircraft the country could not replace. Flown by pilots it could not replace faster still. Then the war came home. Egyptian Tu-16 bombers, aircraft that in our timeline burned on their runways in the first hour, began reaching Tel Aviv and Haifa at night. The damage was modest by the standards of great wars. The shock was not. Israel had built its entire doctrine on keeping war away from its cities, and now sirens wailed over them nightly. Mordechai Hod's Air Force, planned around a knockout blow, found itself rationing sorties between defending home airspace and supporting an army that had expected to advance under an empty sky. The consequences of that shortfall would prove catastrophic in the sands below. But first we need to see what the ground war had become. Yitzhak Rabin's war plan assumed air supremacy the way an architect assumes gravity. The armored divisions of Tal, Yoffe, and Sharon crossed into Sinai anyway. Israel had no choice, with the straits closed and mobilization bleeding the economy dry, but they fought a different war than the one history records. Without fighter bombers ranging freely ahead of them, Egyptian positions at Rafah, Abu Ajala, and the passes had to be reduced position by position, minefield by minefield, at a cost in tanks and men that mounted daily. Egypt's advantages were squandered in turn. Amer's headquarters issued contradictory orders, countermanded them, and issued them again. Whole brigades marched and countermarched while Israeli units ground forward. The result was neither the rout of our timeline nor an Egyptian victory, but something crueler than either, A stalemate in the dunes, two armies bleeding toward the Mitla and Gidi passes, while the casualty lists in Cairo and Tel Aviv grew long. With Israel's air force consumed over Sinai, King Hussein's front hardened. In our history, Jordan's participation collapsed in 2 days once Israeli jets owned the sky. Here, Jordanian long-range artillery pounded West Jerusalem day after day, and the Arab Legion, still the best-trained soldiers in the Arab world, held the ridgelines of the West Bank with a stubbornness Israel's planners had feared and hoped never to test. Ammunition Hill was taken, lost, and taken again. The old city fell only after days of brutal infantry fighting through alleys too narrow for tanks, house by house, under the eyes of a world that watched holy ground become a battlefield. In the north, Syria's guns on the Golan Heights shelled the settlements below as they had for years, and the offensive that in our timeline seized the plateau in the war's final days was postponed indefinitely. Israel simply had nothing left to climb the escarpment with. The war Israel had planned to finish in a week was entering its second, and then its third. As the fighting stretched on, the war stopped belonging to the men fighting it. Soviet transport aircraft began landing in Cairo with crated fighters and spare parts. Brezhnev and Kosygin could not let their principal Arab client bleed out. In Washington, Lyndon Johnson faced the confrontation he had dreaded. Mired in Vietnam, he had warned Israel against striking first. Now he confronted a grinding Middle Eastern war, Soviet hints about readying airborne divisions, and an ally demanding resupply America was reluctant to give. The Washington-Moscow hotline, used in our timeline for a handful of tense messages that June, carried traffic daily. Johnson pressed Eshkol toward a ceasefire, but a ceasefire from stalemate meant Israel accepting closed straits, shelled cities, and an intact Nasser, terms that looked from Jerusalem like a slow-motion defeat. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed, in a room very few Israelis knew existed. By late May 1967, Israel had quietly assembled its first crude nuclear devices at Dimona, a fact hidden from its own public and from most of its allies, including the United States. In our timeline, that capability stayed in the shadows, its moment of temptation deferred to the darkest hours of 1973. In this one, the debate came 6 years early, with cities under air attack, ammunition stocks draining, and casualty figures unlike anything in the state's short history. Eshkol's cabinet reviewed what Dimona had produced, 2, perhaps 3 devices, and an improvised plan for a demonstration blast over the empty desert, a flash on the horizon meant to end the war without crossing the final line. It was not a decision so much as an argument, bitter and circular, in a cabinet of exhausted men. Dayan saw leverage, others saw the end of every restraint that kept small wars small. Eshkol, cautious to his core, held the authority and withheld the order. But preparations at the site did not go unnoticed. American intelligence caught the signs, and suddenly Johnson was managing not just a war, but an ally standing at the nuclear threshold. The revelation broke the deadlock. Faced with the prospect of a nuclear demonstration in the world's most volatile region, Johnson moved with a speed Vietnam had never seen from him, and Moscow, equally alarmed, moved with him. A superpower-imposed ceasefire came down like a curtain, freezing the lines roughly where the armies stood. Israel holding ground in Sinai, and a shattered, united Jerusalem. Syria untouched on the Golan. The straits reopened under international guarantee, no one victorious. Every party walked away diminished and changed. Nasser survived as the man who was not destroyed, his myth dented but intact, presiding over a wrecked air force and an unbroken army. Israel had held, at a cost in blood and treasure, that ended the illusion of short wars, and its arsenal was now an open secret, shadowing every future crisis a decade ahead of schedule. The Middle East settled into an armed truce beneath that shadow, without the total victory that in our world redrew the map, and without the total defeat that fueled the next war. History turned on a radar warning that either would or would not be heard. In our timeline, it died on a desk in Cairo, and the war lasted 6 days. It is worth remembering how many of the outcomes we treat as inevitable borders, doctrines, even the nuclear age in the Middle East balanced, on that June morning, on a few minutes and a single message.